All right. Again, privat Mobius. So nice to be here. Uh, it has been a really exciting week for us. So a few days ago, we took a plane from New York City to Russia. It's both of our first time in Russia. And in New York City, we're actually there because we live in San Francisco. But we were invited by Apple to come there because our little app, Spectre, had won their award for the iPhone App of the Year. Which is crazy, super cool. So here's a photo of us with Phil Schiller. Phil Schiller is like the head of marketing and product at Apple, basically the number 2 after Tim Cook. And this is one of those photos that makes you go like, record scratch. You're probably wondering how we ended up in this situation. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So a little intro first. I'm Sebastiaan. My full name has a lot of A's in it. That's just the Dutch thing. And I'm a designer living in San Francisco. When I'm not doing design work, usually I take photos. I love photography. And I also ride motorcycles and put them together. I think my thing is falling off a little bit. There we go. That's better. So I'm Dutch. I was not born and raised in California or anything. I originally am from there. And when I looked at this flag, I noticed that it's kind of like the Russian flag. I'm not sure who was there. I'm not pointing any fingers. So, maybe one person copied the other. But where I grew up was not the city or anything. I grew up in the countryside. It looked like this. It was a country boy. And in the countryside, I was, raised to be a proper farm boy, but in my teenage years, I became a little bit of a rebel. And I was not the easiest kid. I spent most of my time not going to school and mostly, looking angry and photoshopping stuff a lot. So I loved making really random art in Photoshop. It was kind of like my thing. And that kind of progressively got weirder as I played with Photoshop more. I'm not sure if anyone remembers Bryce 3D, like old 3D studio thing. Played with that a lot. I'm not sure exactly what this is supposed to be. Looks kind of crazy. It only got crazier the more I learned Photoshop. This is like a fox and a city on lettuce. Kind of bizarre. Really, it got weirder the more Photoshop I learned. I don't even know where to begin with this one. Super odd. But anyway, with all this Photoshop work, I got into art school. And in art school, I got my first Mac. And I fell in love, not with the hardware itself necessarily, but really with the OS. Like when I used Mac OS, I thought, wow, this is strangely really satisfying to use. It's a beautiful operating system. And there's these small tasks that suddenly I enjoyed more than anything. Like I shouldn't really be enjoying. I was thinking, oh, it's kind of fun to just rearrange files. It's so nice to adjust settings. Everything is so natural, intuitive, simple, and beautiful. Like things looked really beautiful. And I wanted to know why that was. I wanted to see if it just made me really excited. I wanted to see if I could figure that out for myself. And I was going to start with a small project. I didn't like this icon, the preview icon. It had kind of a creepy looking kid in it. So I decided to just make my own. I was like, okay, I'll make my own cool looking preview icon. I made it in Photoshop. This is the very first icon I designed, and I was hooked. There's lots of issues with this icon. It's not a good icon, but I decided to make a lot of icons, and it was just my thing. It's what I did all day. I made this little icon pack to let people customize their icons in their Mac. I love doing that. Then I got work from like small Mac developers. They were like, hey, I've make an app. Maybe you can make an icon for me. And I was like, wow, $15 an hour? Sweet. Yeah, let's do it. Then I even made an app of my own. This is when the iPod was a thing. And I made an app to let you see what time zone you're in compared to other people. So if you're in Moscow, maybe you want to see what the time is in San Francisco. You can see that it has a 10, 11 hour offset by scrolling through the time zones. There is no API for making iPod apps. I also cannot code. I have to say, like, I'm really bad at code things. So this was actually me making images in Photoshop and then syncing them to an iPod as a photo album so you could scroll through it. It's really bad. So an app. But then I started getting like proper freelance work. I did some work for HP. As a freelancer, they made this touchscreen computer called the HP TouchSmart, and I helped them make a user interface and an iconography for it, which was super fun. And then everything changed because the iPhone came out. And all those, I was super excited to see it. Everybody was super excited about this device. And of course, all those small Mac developers that I work with that made icons for and interfaces with, they wanted to make apps. So I worked with them and other developers to make iPhone apps. So I worked with my friend David Lanham on this one. This one is called Classics. And in Classics, we made the first iPhone reading app that had like a shelf of books and a three-dimensional page turn transition. It was kind of like iBooks before the iBooks. It was much worse built than iBooks, but it was really cool. And it works on other little tiny apps like currencies as well. It was a just super fun time. Everybody was making little apps. Eventually, I realized my dream. Obviously, I was super pulled into the app ecosystem. I was really pulled into Apple, and I got to work at Apple on the device that I love so much. And I joined a group called Internet Services, and I made something called Mobile Me. This was before iCloud. The cloud is already there, but Mobile Me was slightly before that. And I got to work on iPhone apps, Mac apps, web UI, all that kind of stuff. And more so than I had done before, this was pixel perfect design. This is not like the wireframes you see a lot where they just draw black and white sketches and stuff. At Apple, everything is down to the pixel perfect. Everything. Every mock-up you make for every design review has to look like the best work you've ever done, and it's ready to ship. And my clients previously were not always easy. You know, I would make a design and they would be very demanding, and they would say, okay, this needs to look really good. And but I always managed to make something good, and they always said, oh yes, this is great, perfect, we'll build it. The client at Apple was one man in particular. He was very difficult, so I would make my best work, just the very best work I've ever done. And he would have very detailed feedback, but one word only. He just came back and said, no. And I would make my best work. I would spend weeks making these icons or UIs and stuff. And sometimes this was the only feedback you would get back. That's it. You just go back to the drawing board. It's really frustrating when you make your best work and you're at the end, you're so tired. I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do now. And the solution was sometimes to take a step back from your work and say, okay, I did good work, but that's not me. You know, while I feel really sad about throwing it away, it doesn't reflect badly on me. I just have to do something new. And you know, sometimes you make something and you think it's nice, but it's just missing a little. I don't know what it's missing, but it's missing a little. Sometimes you just have to throw it out and start over. That's an important lesson, to be able to kill your darlings. It's hard, but sometimes it really helps. Anyway, it was time for me to move on. I'd worked at Apple for a few years, and Apple's a slow-moving company, so the product came out, which was cool. I got to see the keynote. And this is Eddie Q introducing an app I worked on. It was called Find My Friends.
You see a list of your family and friends that are sharing their location with you.
Oh, it was cool. I was like on the stage and everybody was cheering about it. It was out. It looked like this. I was really curious to see what the internet thought of it. Here's Gizmodo. Oh. Okay. Let's see what maybe Fast Company is a design website. Maybe they'll Tacky software. Oh, they're specifically talking about fake leather. Joni Ive becomes Apple's chief of human interface. No more stitched leather in iOS. I love this one because this on Quora there was a question about it, saying, what does stitched leather have to do with finding my friends? And Emma says, nothing. It has nothing to do with finding your friends. It's ugly. It's tacky. I have no relationship with this man. I don't know. It's amazing. But again, it was that important lesson, right? You have to be able to kind of take a step back from the work and realize, I am not the work I do. It was really good for me to externalize it and think, criticism is good. And honestly, none of us were all that excited about making an app in leather anyway. It was just someone who really wanted us to design it like that. And your work, I mean, it's just your work. You can walk away. It's not going to be tied back to you forever or anything like that. Anyway, so it was a little bit hard sometimes to deal with the criticism, but I took a break from work and took a motorcycle ride to Alaska to take a really big break, kind of clear my mind from everything design and work and stuff. And when I came back, I just did freelance design work in San Francisco. And as I was sitting there behind my computer checking Twitter, I got a message on Twitter from Ben, and he said, hey, would you also be interested in making a camera app? And I didn't have to think about it for very long.
So let's switch over to me. Hi, I'm Ben, and I'm actually, I'm actually going to go even further back than Sebastiaan, like way back to me in elementary school, and that little dungeon thing was actually the computer lab in my elementary school, and I'm that kid in the back right there, sitting next to the Apple II GS. And this was my first introduction to programming, was on a Mac. And it was actually using this language logo where you have moved this turtle around to draw on the screen. I don't know if that was before the time of a lot of people here, but it was my first introduction also to graphics. And I always loved computer graphics. Like in university, as my final project my senior year, I implemented an algorithm to recreate the diffraction color in a butterfly wings. And I thought, man, I'd work maybe when I graduate, I'll work in maybe video games or maybe in the movies and visual effects. And then once you actually graduate, you find out it's gonna take a while. And it's not a good place to really get involved because this might be a university thing, but we have student loans and you gotta pay those back. And entry-level job in these industries doesn't pay a whole lot. So this was around the same time as this other thing was happening, which is called Web 2.0. So there was all these social networking apps coming out. And I figured, just like an actor might wait tables, maybe I should just sort of start out in web development and get my career underway there. And then something important happened. This device came out that you could immediately tell was going to change everything. And we were going to probably use these mobile devices more often. And I'd love to do more development on that device. And a second thing happened. In my career, I was sort of finding myself bored with what I was working on. And I really wanted to work on something that mattered a lot to me. And I made a list of all the companies and products that I really love to use. And I kept returning to this one website I was wasting all my time on my phone. And they actually needed a mobile developer. And they were just starting out. They were this small San Francisco company. And I'm like, well, I'll just sort of apply online. And I got the job. And they moved me up to San Francisco. And I stayed there for a few years. And then, it turned out to be this kind of big IPO thing happening. And the company was Twitter. And after about 4.5 years of that, I'm in a new challenge where I'm wondering, okay, so now what? I have the ability and the skill where I can sort of choose what I want to work on. And so I decided to take some time off. I don't have a motorcycle, so instead I got into my hobby that I always wanted to pursue, which is photography. And so I bought a good digital SLR and some great lenses, and I got really knee-deep and really, really absorbed everything I could about photography, messing around with everything from flash photography to long exposures, all these different styles. And I thought, you know what? I don't think I'll ever make a successful business out of this. No one pays for apps anymore. But I'd love to build a camera app to scratch my own itch. And, whatever comes out of it, at least I'll have a calling card. So if I do freelancing with iOS or I go on to something else, at least I'll have something with my name attached. And why did I want to build a camera app? It's because, cameras were apps at the time. I downloaded all the third-party apps, and I was thinking, they're really missing a few key features. And it's bizarre, because these devices are so powerful, but they don't have the features you get out of this big, clunky device running ancient firmware. Why is it that all of the histograms are after you take the photo? Or if they are on the viewfinder, why are they so laggy? So as you can see by my amazing design skills here, this is the first version of Halide. It was very brutalist, very minimalist, but it was a proof of concept, wait a minute, why can't we do a real-time histogram to show the different exposure levels in sync with what you're seeing in the viewfinder? Well, there's no technical reason you can't do that with some shaders. Okay, the high-end Sony cameras have this feature called focus peaking. And with focus peaking, it'll actually highlight the sharpest points in the image to know what's in focus as you move forward and back. Here, of course, I'm iterating on the brilliant design, adding multiple controls. And you see the very early version of Halide here really going through all of these concepts. But, okay, cool. So the technical questions, it is technically possible to build a sophisticated camera app using iPhone hardware. Okay. There's a third piece that was really missing, and that was magic. What do I mean by that? If you look at the music app or a lot of first-party apps from Apple, if you do a search up in the search field for a song, and then you leave the app, and you come back to the app in an hour, it will clear the search results and return you back to the default state. And that's because if you were to do a search, leave the app, and come back, you don't want to see, wait, why was I searching for this random song? It would sort of interrupt you as you're returning to the app. Well, this isn't a coincidence. This isn't the app getting ejected from memory. Apple's actually has a timer in the app that if you leave the app and return to it after 5 minutes, it will clear your search results to give a better user experience. But until I told you that right now, you might not have noticed that. Most people will never notice that it's doing these little details to give you a better user experience. And so when people say magic, I'm actually stealing from Teller, from the famous magician duo Penn and Teller. And the way he describes a magic trick is that the secret to a lot of magic tricks is that they are a lot more trouble than the trick seems worth. You will be fooled by a trick if it involves more time, money, and practice than you or any other sane onlooker would be willing to invest. And I wanted to use an app that had that sort of attention to detail where someone would say, why would they bother with this? Like, no one's going to notice this. But it's these small details that together give you this magical experience. So as you can tell, I'm, of course, a great designer if I just practice for the next 20 years just on design. But you know what? I should probably find someone else who is interested in detail and is passionate about photography on the design side as I am on the engineering. So it just so happened there's this person who I follow on Twitter who posted this review that took place over 2.5 years of using the Leica M camera. And it's an insane, thousands of words review that goes into every little detail about this traditional camera. And I'm like, wow, this person seems like they'd be awesome to collaborate with. So I sent them a direct message asking, would you like to collaborate with me? And they sent this really abrasive response, like, oh, okay, well, I guess he's really into this. And that's when we sort of knew, all right, let's do this.
Yeah. And so one of the things that Ben kind of touched on that made me really excited to work on a camera app was a thing that I call the camera problem. Now, all of you in the crowd right now have a camera. You might have already used it to take photos of our talk. Why then, if we all have cameras, do cameras still exist, right? We all have camera phones. We have great and yet every year improving cameras on our smartphones. Why do these kind of things still exist? Now, with such great cameras, you still realize that there is a small physical component to that. You know, there are obviously situations in which you simply cannot take photos with a smartphone. You might need extreme reach, basically telescopic lenses and that kind of stuff. But that's not the only cameras that are sold. There's still cameras sold like this. So why is that? Why exactly do cameras still get sold if we have such great cameras in our smartphones? The reason is quite simple. If you give a camera like this to a child, they will immediately start to play with it. Cameras are delightful tactile objects. There's these little knobs, usually several at the top. There's the lens. There's little clicky bits to it. Cameras are just over 100 years old now, and they have a really nice tactile, wonderful quality to it. If we wanted to bring something like that, this camera-ness, this inherent feeling of something being a camera to a camera on our phone, which is basically just a piece of glass, we'd have to look carefully at how to redesign the camera on the phone. There's two types of camera apps already out there, especially by the time when we started making Halide, there were two types of apps, simple camera apps and complex camera apps. We'll look at the simple one first. The best example of a simple camera app, and I think one of the best interfaces ever made, is the camera app on the iPhone. Or for that matter, smartphone camera apps in general, but this particular tap-to-focus interface was really smart. Everybody can use the iPhone camera. You can just take a photo by pressing the shutter, you see the results, and if you need to change something about the parameters, you just kind of tap on an object. So a good example would be, there's a flower in the foreground, and there's a beautiful landscape behind it. Obviously, you tap on the flower, and the camera will make sure that it's in focus, and it's exposed correctly. But how many of us have had that thing where you tap on the flower, and then the background is too bright or too dark, and things change, and you're just like, ugh. And the tapping feels like you're communicating through some sort of Morse code to a small, tiny monkey that's in your phone controlling the camera, and it's really, really frustrating. You kind of get this look on your face. You're like, not fun. Anyway, we can call that a one-dimensional interface, because there's one point, a simple point of interaction that you can kind of give intent to the camera. That's very simple, obviously. On the other side of the aisle is complex camera apps. Looking at complex camera apps, I figured we might as well just grab a screenshot really quick to look at one. Here's a screenshot of a complex camera app. Oh, I must have mixed it up. I think that might actually be an airplane. But you get the idea. There's a lot of toggles, especially when we set out to make Halide. These kind of camera apps had every single button, every single switch, every single option available. You look at it and you're like, whoa, I was scared and I knew how to use cameras. Like, it's very intimidating. It's a lot of buttons. Photography is a complex problem. You have exposure, you have aperture, you have focus, you have all sorts of critical things you have to balance, much like a cockpit like this. The last time I was faced with a complex problem, you're all going to laugh at me. My complex problem was CSS. I couldn't understand it at all. There was fortunately a little program made by a Belgian developer, Jan van Bochout. He made an app called CSS Edit. And CSS Edit was one of the first visual CSS editors. So if you change something, it would actually change things alive in the page, much like the web inspectors do now. And it would really help me figure out how CSS worked, how every property worked, how it affected things, what cascading was, how things get inherited and stuff like that. And in a sense, putting that kind of a simple interface on such a complex problem of cascading style sheets, it sounds complex, was really powerful. And there's actually a name for bringing a super simple UI to a complex problem. You're teaching. It's how we kind of bite off a small problem and you show how it works as you go along. That is really empowering because it teaches people while at the same time actually doing the thing they're trying to learn. Could we bring that somehow to the camera? It would be really empowering if we make such a simple interface that people could figure out how photography worked without even knowing the terms for it. It's not as easy as just slapping like a simple interface on top of all the other stuff. We can build on what we already have. The one-dimensional interface is great. How do we expand on that? We can look at photography itself. Photography has tons of solved problems. It's very old. It's a 100-year-old field. This is how people used to take photos. I love the beard. That's back in style again, I guess. But look at the camera. How do you hold a camera? The camera has several interfaces. You can look at them like this. Usually you have a little exposure wheel like this. You move it up and down like that. Focus goes like that. Pretty standard. Every camera works like that. So looking at this one again, exposure and focus, left and right, and up and down. We could do something with that. So we made a two-dimensional interface. Of course, you can still do the tapping thing, right? Tap works fine, but maybe you have a slightly more complex intent. You didn't want to have that flower in focus. You just wanted it to be a little brighter or darker. Swipe up, swipe down, much like the camera wheel works. Oh, you wanted to have the lizard in focus but not touch the exposure? Swipe left, swipe right. Mind you, that's the focus peaking that Ben was talking about earlier, so you can see it made it into the app with a slightly more sophisticated user interface. And this is how it works in practice. So you can see, well, maybe not. This was a video at one point, but you get the idea. So you can swipe up and down, and then in the bottom you have a focus sort of ring that you can use to make sure stuff is in focus. So where does that put us in this scale of simple and complex? Kind of a little bit of both. We have the simple interface and we retain all the features of it. You can still tap, you can still not change anything if you just want to take a photo, but we still offer the complexity of custom exposure, custom focus, that kind of stuff. But then there was that other thing that I really liked, right? Tactile. How do we make it like a camera-like stuff? It's like, it's nice that we now have the flexibility of the camera. The controls are right there. How do we make it feel like a camera? That became our founding principle, tactile camera-ness. Starting with the most obvious problem, the button. It didn't feel good. Buttons on cameras are usually clicky, super good-feeling objects. So we went completely the full mile. We were like, okay, how do we make it so like it properly pushes in a little bit, feels like it's a button that really moves under your finger. So we animated it. This is something that the iOS camera does now, after about a year after we did it. And it feels a lot better that way, instead of it just darkening. So at that point, why stop with one button? Why not all the buttons? So we explored how good can all the buttons feel. They all have this little inset. They all have a little bit of an animation when you touch them. We prototyped that to make sure that it felt really, really good. How do people get introduced to your camera? In the past, if you bought a camera, it came with a little tiny booklet, and in the booklet it told you a few quick start tips. how to get started with it. So hey, we could design it after one of those, maybe a little funky retro design, and then if people actually use it, they can actually leaf through it. So this is how it worked the first time we opened Halide. We actually have this page curl animation to go through the pages of the manual, really funky. We went as far as possible with this. We made a custom typeface that was based on, like, if you look at a camera lens, you know, it's like they etched the numbers in it with these metal rounding bits, and we decided to make a typeface that looks like that. So it feels a lot like a real camera if you look at the topography. The icons were also based on that. Anyway, there was a ton of other stuff, obviously, but we tried to throw it all in there, and we launched it. Now, as you might recall, Ben was in a place where, you know, we were starting a new project, and I was in a place where I was freelancing. This was not where we thought we were going to start a business. We wanted to scratch an itch, meaning we wanted to make an app that we liked, and then if 10 people downloaded it and said, hey, this is awesome, then it would have been a success for us. Even if it was just for us, this was a fun way to occupy our time. But it did pretty well. When we launched, there was one chart for all apps and games, and we became the #2 paid app on the App Store when we launched, just under Minecraft. Damn you, Notch. So we didn't quite make it to #1. But that was extremely exciting, and it really made us want to, you know, keep at it, keep working on this thing. It was really encouraging, and now we had some users also that we wanted to make sure we supported. The same year, the new iPhone came out, the iPhone 10, so we had to completely redesign the app. Yay, the pleasure of being a designer. But we also kept fixing bugs, adding features, and all that kind of stuff. But by now, what was in the back of our minds, now that Halide was real, was what's next. Right, Ben?
So the first request that we looked at, as soon as we could step back and look at what users had requested early on in Halide, like a big project, from day one, it was long exposures. Okay, now, if you're not a photographer, usually when you take a photo, you capture the photo in about 1/30th of a second. So that way, even if you're holding your camera in your hand, you get a clear, sharp image that's a frozen moment in time. Now, a long exposure is the opposite of that, where you deliberately capture an image over several seconds. So details sort of blur together. And so in this case, this water becomes painterly. And there are also not just artistic reasons to do this, but practical ones. So if you take a long exposure at a tourist spot with lots of crowds, the people will sort of fade away and disappear if you capture over a long enough period of time. So long exposures are pretty popular with traditional cameras. Why didn't we include them in Halide? Well, there were hardware reasons. You see, this little sensor on your phone is not designed to be active for several seconds. There are heat issues, and at the time we launched Halide, the iOS clamped it at a maximum of 1/2 of a second. The iPhone 11 Pro, like the top-of-the-line iPhone, only supports up to 1 second, because in addition to making your phone really hot to the touch, it probably would damage components if it allowed you to do like a 9-second exposure. So we can't do it directly in hardware, but what if we take multiple images and fuse them together? For example, like this classical photo by Gijon Mili, where he takes multiple images and exposes them and combines the exposure. Now, in this case, each individual image is taken over, 1/30th of a second. And what we would do is we would take, say, 9 exposures, each exposure 1 second each. So they when you merge them together, it's the equivalent of capturing 9 seconds. Okay, that should work, but there's an existential question. Should this feature be built into Halide, or should we spin it out into a separate product? And it's a difficult question because there are just design complications of putting more features into your main app. I mean, this goes against conventional wisdom that once you have one hit, you should milk every ounce you can out of it. Like just throw in a hamburger menu and just like keep putting stuff in there because you're never going to get a second chance, right? And long exposures are kind of a niche feature. How do we know when users are going to want them, and when should we expose in the UI? I mean, should we be smart about it? And like, if it looks like you want a long exposure, pop up a clip. You're like, hey, you're trying to make a long exposure, right? That never really works out. it would be better for this product maybe to breathe on its own with a full UI. So setting aside just our design sensibilities, there's also a product opportunity. Now, we've targeted photographers who are enthusiasts, like pro photographers, people who are really into photography, but that wouldn't really cover my parents who just sort of want a casual experience. And it's like Porsche, they started out with this cool race car, the 911, which has 2 seats. So if you have like kids or a dog, it's not a practical car. But then they realized, okay, well, we can take some of our sensibilities and apply it to a more mainstream audience. So now they make SUVs or cars with 4 seats. And actually, most of their revenue comes from the Cayenne, although they still are true to their enthusiasts with the 911. So maybe we could also find a way of taking what we've learned, apply these sensibilities, and create something that our parents would be able to use. But there is one risk of spinning out a separate app, and that's like, hey, I paid for your app 2 years ago. Why isn't this a free update, right? Well, of course, there's a risk there. But on the other hand, we had users who bought our app 2 years ago and were saying, you know, I feel really bad that I paid for this app 2 years ago and you haven't put in any in-app purchases, there haven't been any paid upgrades. I really want to give you more money. And when your users are telling you this is a really good sign that maybe you should start looking at building another app. You know, it's like building up, it's like putting goodwill into a bank. If you do good by your users long enough and you really accumulate enough goodwill, you can withdraw some, and in our case, build a separate app, and they'll give us the benefit of the doubt, try it out, and maybe create a second opportunity. So the challenge, though, is now, if we're going to build a long exposure app, what is missing from it? And how do we bridge the gap compared to a digital SLR? And Sebastian's still working on here, but if you were to take a long exposure, the biggest challenge is keeping your arms steady, right? And so you need to lug around a tripod to carry this thing, which if you're traveling around with your significant other, lugging around a tripod like a dork, like they have to be really patient if you just want to go on a nature hike, right? So that alone makes it impractical. So maybe what if we at least help users out, and if they aren't going to carry around a tripod, at least educate them about how steady they're holding the hand, right? And so, all right, well, at least let's put in a stabilizer in the app that prompts the user as to how shaky they're holding it. So we put this little adorable iPhone inside of a widget there, and it reads the accelerometer. So if you aren't holding it steady, maybe you've had too many cups of coffee, it'll bounce around there, and you want to try to keep it lined inside of those brackets. And if you hold it for a few seconds, this stable label lights up below the indicator to let you know you're good to go. Why don't you take a photo? It wasn't good enough. Like, unless you have robot arms, again, you aren't able to take a truly sharp photo. You're going to have to put it on some kind of device, and it isn't the type of feature then that we could see there being enough people who want to download this app that it's going to be anything more than for photo nerds like us. So do we just like not ship it, or what do? We've already invested a bunch in building up the app until this point. We'd already built the engine to do basic fusion of the images. Do we just throw it out? And then we sort of had an epiphany. So we've been trying to blur together a bunch of these images at 1 second each. But both of us are photographers, and we know that, as I said earlier, you can hold an image, your hand, at 1/130th of a second and get a sharp image. Maybe we're approaching the problem all wrong. We actually need more photos. So what if we take, instead of 1 photo over 1 second, 30 photos every second at 1/30th of a second, so each individual image is sharp. And then we use computer vision algorithms to register the image together using image registration algorithms so that each sharp image properly fuses with the other. That might work. And this is absolutely terrifying, because I've never done math like this. You know, I've been doing web development. That's not like, man, that's nothing like this. So that's scary. So I'm going to be going into new territory. And more importantly, we don't want this experience to be one where you take a video and then you wait for it to process, and then you go into an editor and you adjust the settings. We want it to be almost like the first-party camera. You pull out the app, you take the exposure, you look at it, and you put it away. So we didn't want people to fiddle with it. That means that it needs to be done in real time. And we don't have 1 second per image to process it. We need to be processing 30 frames per second. And that's scary. In part because this sort of computer vision is very resource intensive. So with Halide, we're supporting devices way, way back that can't push as many pixels. So, okay, what can we do to de-scope risk? And we decided, all right, most of the features that we have already scoped out for this app, they're useful even without this handheld stabilization that might or might not work. So what if we just require an iPhone 8 or above for this one particular feature, and we're only going to charge, what, like $3 for it? All right, we think that we still deliver value even if you have an older device. And then later, after we launch, if people like the app, we can go back and see how we can optimize it on old devices. But we have to de-scope risk and move forward. Otherwise, you'll never ship the app, and we'll never know exactly what we're building. So we set that aside. Let's try it. Let's build a prototype and dog food it out in the wild. And so I went on vacation to Kyoto for the first time. And if you've ever been to like one of these bamboo forests, they are full of crowds. All right, it's not nearly as pretty as the National Geographic photographers would have you believe, because there's all of these tourists wanting to take the same beautiful photos. And so I pulled out the app, and that's kind of the epiphany. Like, we found something that really resonates, like, oh my God, I was shooting this handheld. I'm no longer the jerk with a tripod. and it was mind-blowing. Like, we took something we thought might be photo nerd-centric, and like, I could see this being something big that anyone could use, that my parents could use this. And we went, my wife and I went to this other shrine, which also has way too many tourists, and took a photo, and it erased this dude with his jacket, and I had this beautiful, pristine photo like you'd print in a magazine. That's amazing. And so when this happened, and we realized this combination of computer vision with this user interface, we sort of struck the anthem of the app, which is Spectre is an intelligent shutter. Spectre is an intelligent shutter. And then everything else sort of flowed out from there.
Well, Ben says everything flows out from there, but then as a designer, that's where the problem begins. An intelligent shutter. What does that even begin to look like? Obviously, we had a lot of visual quality in Halide. People really praised the app for that. It'd be great to build on that. Make it different, but recognizable. Halide is an app that, for photographers, signals a lot. It's very polished. It has this clear, like, yellow highlight. Looks great. Then there's things in here that signal to photographers that it is a photography app. Look at the focus skill on the bottom, which kind of looks like what a lens on a camera looks like. And there's a level in the top left. These are all little things that photographers see and think, oh, cool, this is a real tool that I can use. If I turn this around and give this to my dad, or my mom, they will be extremely intimidated by it. Because they don't know what an EV is, they don't know what levels are. It kind of looks like one of those things from Star Trek when they used a computer and people are just like, whoa, that looks really complicated. That probably controls a nuclear power plant. And they're not too far off. Again, photography is complicated. It'd be cool if we could build on that, though. Cameras do look cool, and they feel cool, like we talked about before. So we took our typeface, we adapted it, we made it a bit wider, a bit more breathing room, a bit more comfortable looking. But we did ditch one thing. We made sure that all these photographic terms, white balance, raw capture, exposure settings, shutter speed, f-stops, ISO sensitivity, they were banned. No more photographic terms. These things make people scared. I mean, if we want to make this app, we should make it not for photographers. Photographers could use it, but it wasn't an app for photographers. That's a big difference, because Halide, if you look at Halide, it's a camera app, and everybody obviously knows how that works, but it's also a camera app for people who have already tried the iPhone camera app, and now they want something maybe a bit more powerful. So they have a natural interest in more photography. Maybe they don't know everything yet, but they do want to be on the more complex side of interactions. Spectre, we wanted it to just kind of be a magic button. This is the fun part, because I get to design what a magic button looks like. We ended up with this design, but we, picked a cool color that stood apart from Halide. It's not yellow, it's not like a classic techie blue, kind of an in-between. It's this, we call it like neon mint. It's a very cool, different color. Magic shutter button. And the founding principle kind of came all the way around that. We decided to focus on simplicity first, not a tactile element, not camera likeness. Simplicity. Simplicity for photography has been the mother of all of its greatest innovations. And my favorite example of that is the Polaroid Sx-70. Now, the Sx-70 came out in 1972. In 1972, cameras looked like this. This is a 1972 camera from right over here. It's called the Cristal. And photography was easy back then. I'll walk you through it. You probably recognize the dials. We already went over it. That's the ISO dial on the right. So you have to put in your film of a certain ISO light sensitivity. You set your shutter speed. Of course, you balance it with the aperture, the pupil on the lens to let in the adequate amount of light. And then you focus it so the image is sharp. And then you're done. No, wait, you're not done at all. After that, you have to take the camera, rewind the film back into the container, and then you bring the film either to your own darkroom or to a company or a shop that will develop your film. They will then take the negatives that have been developed, project them onto prints, so you have prints and you can look at your photos. Easy, right? But this back then was revolutionarily easy. I mean, cameras used to be set up on tripods with big things and like the things over them. You had a big plate and you would project on there, so that seems pretty easy. Shall I show you how this worked? 1972. Check it out. There's your camera. Before that, it didn't even look like a camera. Now, autofocus was not invented yet, but what you did have is a little focus wheel on the top, and then what was maybe the closest to the iPhone technology would ever come in the next 40 years, one button. That's it. Stop where the magic stops. Smile. There's your photo. It just develops. This is still impressive today. This is really cool. This is the one photo. It doesn't store it. There's no negative. There it goes. It's just gone again. In 10 minutes, I'll have my photo. Back then, it was faster. Those chemicals are now forbidden. They're too toxic. But really cool. That was a total innovation. That was incredible. Now, note what is missing from this thing are those dials. Where's the shutter speed? Where's the aperture? Why is the ISO sensitivity? The reason these dials aren't on there is because Edwin Land, the creator of Polaroid, said, we need to constrain this thing and make it not for people who are photographically inclined. We want to address everybody, so people don't have to go to a textbook and find out what ISO is, what shutter speeds are, what aperture you need at what amount of light. We need to remove those things. And I, as a photographer, taking photos with this, I would love those dials on this camera so I can tweak it because I know what I want. But that would also make it completely useless to the majority of people. So Spectre could take photos of any duration, pretty much. But we decided to limit it. We decided to add a constraint. We gave people 3 choices, 3, 5, 9 seconds. We don't even call them exposure times. It's just like a mode. In the bottom right, there's a little wheel. You can choose 3, 5, 9. For most people, a 3-second exposure is perfect. You can hold it pretty steady in 3 seconds. Again, we use stabilization, so that really helps. And with that, we kind of started putting the UI together, these minimal, simple elements with simple choices. And then there was the app icon. I mean, I can talk to an hour about this. Sorry, you invited a designer to your conference. I'm going to talk about app icons and stuff. But I love making app icons. They're a really important part of your app. They're your brand. And you can kind of communicate really quickly what it's all about. And again, I can rant about this forever, but I'm like, it looks like a camera. It looks like letter S. It looks like circuits. It looks like a brain. It's got that cool color and stuff. So I was really happy with the way that turned out. We spent a lot of time making sure that looked great. That's just the design part, though. Then there was some engineering as well.
So there's one last technical challenge in all of this, and that's having played around with long exposures on a traditional camera years before, I knew that one of the top creative uses of it was to create light trails. So if you were to create a long exposure of a city street, as the cars zoom by, the cars themselves disappear, and you see these streaks of light from the headlight. And there's all sorts of other ways you can apply light trails, but you can't physically recreate this using the algorithm I described earlier where you simply blend together images. The sensor itself doesn't have the dynamic range to isolate just the headlights versus the car. However, we can simulate it using a slightly different algorithm. This is a photo recently posted by a user online of the app, and this is amazing. Like, this this user's incredibly creative, and it's really fulfilling to see like people creating work like this. But this was in a separate mode of the app. And if you apply, unfortunately, this mode to a traditional long exposure, like of moving water, it doesn't look good. But for this one particular use case, light trails, this algorithm is superior. Okay, so we have two different algorithms. So the solution, of course, is to present a separate button to the user, and we're violating the entire intent of the app. One button, capture button, it just works. Well, Spectre is an intelligent shutter. Apple had not long before released Core ML, which solved a lot of the distribution issues of distributing neural networks on device, and a lot of the frameworks to make it easy to train a neural network. So I hopped on Google image search and grabbed a bunch of sample images of where you might want to use light trails. For example, fireworks, sparklers, spinning steel wool on fire, street lights, and I trained a neural network to say, under these circumstances, you want to use the light trail mode. Otherwise, use the algorithm you're probably going to want to use like 90% of the time. Now, rather than present an option to the user, we leave it on auto. So if the user disagrees with what the ML decides on, they can always go in there and switch it, or if they want to deliberately apply light trails to a daylight scene, they can go for it. Sebastiaan came up with the idea that to notify the user of when we're going to be using light trails, that light bulb lights up. So if you know the secret code there, then you can instantly tell without going into the menu, okay, it's going to use light trails on here, okay, and you can use it. But for most users that have never heard the word light trails, it will just work. So that brings us to the final design.
Yeah, so now we have an interface. We know what Spectre was going to look like. Great. We're done, right? A good revelation here, that picture that Ben used to introduce what long exposures are, that was taken with Spectre. It was taken on a windy day in San Francisco, the phone moving around, 9-second exposure. Pretty cool. Looks great. It's ready. There's one issue remaining. Spectre is an intelligent shutter. Halide is a camera. If I talk about a camera, people know what to do with a camera. They point it at something, they tap the button, it takes a photo. That's expected behavior. If I say to you, Spectre takes long exposures, you go like, Spectre takes long what? Sorry, what are we talking about here? The problem was with even making a great interface, you have to communicate exactly what this thing does. It's a little complicated. It's a photographic technique. We could front load this whole thing. We could just kind of give everybody a book of Spectre for Dummies and kind of explain it that way. You just read through this simple 200-page reference guide and you'll understand exactly what long exposures are about. Here's where you use them, here's where you don't. This is what it does, this is what it doesn't. And I mean, there's more complex apps than ours out there. Surely this is a solved problem. We can explain how it works in a certain kind of way that makes more sense. And then what I found is if I started talking to people about what it does, it kind of, people's eyes started going blank and they were kind of like losing interest and starting to play with their phone in the meantime. It could be done better. And there's a different kind of software that explains complex stuff like this really well. Has anyone ever played this game? Show of hands. Nice, nice, nice. Has anyone ever required a tutorial to play this game? YouTube video? For Dummies guide? No hands? No? Yeah, it's pretty easy, right? It shows how you do it because it immediately drops you into it. Pretty easy, brick, jump, etc. You just play around with it, you'll figure it out. Now, there's games much more complicated that do this in a similar way. You don't need tooltips, contextual tooltips, or an onboarding guide for Super Mario, right? So what we decided to do, of course, we don't own the game world. Our game world is the real world, so we can't quite, control everything. The problem with this is that people download our app on the toilet or do it in a meeting or at night in bed. So we made a little mini Spectre inside of Spectre, and basically we show you a scene where you would typically use Spectre. This is a highway. We tell people tap the shutter, and we simulate what it's like to tap the shutter in a cool place. You see the image moving in, like Ben mentioned, we do it real time, so you see it developing. And then when it's done, we take it out of that context, show you the picture, and say, hey, here it is. By the way, it's a live photo, so you can also tap on it, it'll be a movie, and if it's also just a still photo. Nice, that really helps. This way, people can kind of see how it works, much like a game, and we can control the game world to kind of hold their hands. We can't like ship a waterfall or a tourist attraction with the app. After that, we added a few other screens. One note, if you do onboarding, if there's text, people won't read it, ever. But there's that 1% of people that really like this stuff, so you have this in there for them. Most people just swipe past this really quick because they want to use the app, but it's nice to have it in there and say, like, hey, look, we use AI to stabilize it. Hey, we have automatic light trail stuff. We set a snap or a time lapse. We have some durations for you. Assume people don't read it, but just have it in there anyway. It's nice to have, especially for people that are a little older that want to read a bit more before they dive in. Cool. Done. Problem solved. Not really. The one thing we're not taking into account here is we're basically putting people in front of a beautiful place and we give them an empty canvas like, here you go, paintbrush. Make something cool. Bye. Doesn't really work. The reason why, empty canvases are scary. Even I can draw a decent figure, but if you start with something completely empty, it's really kind of disheartening. What you really need, look at a painting app, Procreate for the iPad. There are some sample paintings in there, from really nice to incredibly complex. The reason for that is that it's a creative app. Empty canvases are scary in creative apps, but examples of creativity inspire you. This is why we look at inspiration. That's the cool thing. We see it, and we're inspired by it. And then inspiration inspires creation. It makes you want to go out and try it yourself. Maybe you don't do it well, but you'll want to draw. You want to go out and take some photos. You want to do what you just saw. Now, obviously, we can't ship paintings or anything like that with our app. But what we did do is we added 3 guides for 3 ways of using Spectre. So in the app itself, you can see how you can use the app and the results you get, but also exactly step-by-step how you get there. Kind of inspired by the App Store, which sometimes does stories like this. So simple, easy, digestible stories to show you, hey, here you can get inspired this way on like how to use the app and use it in a way that makes sense to you. You can get some really cool results that way. And like Ben mentioned, these were things that blew us away. When we first did this making people disappear thing, wow, we didn't realize it would be so practical. But you do have to show people that that's something you can do. And if you cram that all into like your onboarding thing, people will be way too overwhelmed to remember it. Have it be there for people to check it out when they have the time. And I would say, okay, now we're done. But unfortunately, we're just kind of never done, It was, however, pretty much time to launch it at this point. You always kind of approach things with the idea that you want it to be perfect, but at some point you do have to actually launch it. It was time to launch.
So this was our second app. We also did one special thing with marketing that we hadn't done with Halide before, which was we actually put in a video in our App Store listing, give an example of what you can pull off with Spectre. And this is what we launched with and presented to users. So how did that do when we launched it? With the butterflies in our stomach, like, okay, will they like us? Will they really like us? And they liked us. We got insane press coverage on launch, and we were the #1 paid app for 6.5 days. Not #1 photo app, #1 paid app. So why half of a day? What happened to that half a day? We accelerated to #1 so quickly that a kill switch triggered automatically on the App Store charts, and they pulled our app from the charts while they could verify that we weren't some kind of scammers. And then so we got seven full days of that. So we did all that with 0 ad spend, and everything went great, although we're never done. So what have we done since then? Well, there were, sadly, we're not perfect, so there were a few bugs on launch day, but also there were a number of users who were like, wait a minute, my photos are blurry. And so remember when I said we weren't going to support the older devices? there are a lot of users on older devices who don't read the App Store description, saying, hey, you really need a modern device for stabilization. So I drank lots of coffee, and over 2 weeks, we implemented a stabilization algorithm that was almost as good as if you're on an iPhone 8 or above. So the middle image is on devices older than iPhone 8, and you're never going to be able to tell the difference if you're just posting your photo to Instagram. This is after I had 4 cups of coffee to give you an idea of how shaky my arm was at the time. And the lesson there is that it's never done, which brings us to where we are today.
Yeah, so today the crazy thing is that we get to enjoy the most satisfying thing of making a tool for creatives, and that's all the output people make. So we get to see this incredible stream of images from people out there in the world in hundreds of countries, literally, taking photos. We have an incredible community here in Russia. There's a lot of really talented photographers, and it's a beautiful country, so we see a lot of shots from places like Russia that we never realized we would see so much from. And it's incredibly inspiring. And then crazy stuff can happen out of nowhere. Like you can suddenly get an email as simple as this. This was an email we got from Apple. This reads as innocent as possible. We got this a few weeks before today. I have an opportunity I'd like to talk to you about that you would find interesting. And it was a phone call from someone who told us that we were invited to go to New York because we had been selected to be the best iPhone app of 2019. Which is crazy, and thank you.
Thanks.
It was really cool, and obviously there's a lot of promotion that comes with that, and there's a great honor that comes with that, but I think what made the biggest difference for me is to realize that all those things that we did, those small things where we said, oh, well, maybe we should go to extra mile for this, maybe we should think about these kind of things, Apple really cares about that. It's a nice, you can look at it from a very cynical way, and you can say Apple really just wants to extract every dollar out of the App Store and just goes for profit. But we did something like this as 2 guys making this, and we cared about it. We made a little tool, we cared so much about it, we did silly things to do that sort of small magical stuff. And that's really why we did what we did. And that's how we got to be in this place.
So there's a reason we started this talk way back in time. And it would be easy if we were giving a talk on Spectre just to start with the app itself. But I think that's not entirely truthful. And I think that you could trace back in all of our history all of the elements that went into it. And nothing's ever really created in a vacuum. It's really the result of a lot of years of work that came before it. And it's a bunch of life lessons. So you combine that with a little luck, and next thing you know, you're a 10-year overnight success. And that's all we got.
Thank you.